Psychedelics are having a huge cultural moment right now. People are looking to them for healing, for awakening, for purpose, for transformation, for answers. And depending on who you ask, psychedelics either are a miracle or a dangerous escape, or a spiritual technology or a therapy. They most certainly are probably one of the most misunderstood tools in modern American culture. But underneath all of that hype, there is this bigger question that doesn't always get talked about. What are people actually searching for when they go looking for these experiences? Because sometimes psychedelics create healing, sometimes they create confusion, sometimes they create meaning, and sometimes they can amplify the exact thing someone's trying to escape if they're not being held in the right way. In today's episode, I'm sitting down with author and Professor John O'Connor to talk about the strange history behind psychedelic culture, the famous experiment that inspired Terence McKenna's work, and the complicated relationship between psychedelics, mysticism, beliefs, healing, and human psychology. And what I really appreciate about this conversation is that it doesn't fall into simple answers. It's honest, it's nuanced, and it explores the part of psychedelics that most people avoid talking about. The meaning people attach to extraordinary experiences and the very human desire to find transformation, healing, and truth. I hope you enjoy. Welcome. This is Leading with Spirit, the show for the spiritual guide who knows there's more. More depth, more truth, more realness in the work you're here to do. Whether you're a healer, coach, or intuitive, this podcast helps you reconnect with your gifts, trust your path, and lead from soul, not stress. Hosted by me, SpiritBird, I'm a master shaman, best-selling author, and founder of Holton Healing Arts. My intention is that each episode brings grounded insight into spiritual growth, energy mastery, and the real-life journey of walking as a spiritual leader. You can find me at SpiritBird Official. Enjoy the show. Hello and welcome back. Thanks for being here with me again on Leading with Spirit. I have a special guest, John O'Connor, with me today. John is the author of A Short and Strange Trip and also a professor at Boston College. And John, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I want to jump right in. I'm so curious if you don't mind sharing, how did your interest in psychedelics start? Where did that come from?
Well, I mean, I don't know how far back you want to go, but really, I experimented with psychedelics starting when I was probably 15, 16 years old. Probably a bad time to start experimenting with drugs, but it just sort of came about that way. I had a group of friends who were we were all very kind of like-minded and drug curious at probably again too young of an age, but I took LSD I think for the first time when I was again 15 or 16, and took it, I don't know, a dozen or so times over the course of the next few years, um, and I think probably what happens with a lot of people with LSD, especially if you begin young, you eventually kind of tap out. Like I think you kind of get from the drug what you can, and you also tend to have, at least a lot of people I've spoken to have had this experience where you tend to have a bad trip or two, and you just kind of wash up a little bit, or wash out rather on that side of things, And so I was always kind of curious about that stuff, and when I um, became started writing, I think I was kind of dancing around it a little bit and touching on drugs and their uses here and there. And then I stumbled upon Terence McKenna during I guess it was like at the end of the pandemic or something. I
Mm.
bought his book, I think is undeniably his greatest book, True Hallucinations. Online, I was probably like a lot of folks during COVID doing a lot of retail therapy and shopping online. I'm an inveterate book buyer. I bought a ton of books, and what I often do with books is instead of reading them, I put them on the shelf, and then they stay there for a year or so, and that's what happened with Terrence's book. And one day I plucked it off the shelf. I think I thought I knew what it was based on the cover. It shows this giant psilocybin mushroom. It's got a little parrot kind of perched on top of it. And I was like, oh, this is some kind of hippy dippy, esoteric thing that has no connection to me or my interests or anything. Although I had bought it, so that undercuts that somewhat. But I had an interest, but I didn't think from a journalistic perspective there. I guess there was much there for me. But then I started reading, was really floored by that book, by Terence's kind of linear narrative and also when and where he was, which I thought was really fascinating. And I also thought it was weird that I had never heard of him. Like, I mean, I sort of prided myself on weirdo psychedelic, not weirdo in a pejorative sense, but just like sort of marginal psychedelic guru types from the 60s and 70s who tend to sail under most people's radars, but not mine, I thought. And so I was shocked by that. Um, and anyway, that was more than you wanted to know, but that's really was the
Yeah,
entry point for me. Kind of, so there's kind of two origin stories, I guess, that came together in the sort of early 2020s.
for sure. And just for the listeners, if you're not familiar with Terrence, this is very broad description, but basically I would call him like the godfather of kind of this brought the psychedelic movement into modern consciousness.
Yeah,
Very,
yeah, absolutely. That's a really short way of saying what I say take many thousands of words to say in my book, which is that Terence really pointed us in the direction of our current psychedelic renaissance. And we can maybe get into that later, but he had a
yeah.
huge outsized impact on our sort of the current movement
Mhm.
in psychedelics.
So, I find it interesting. I kind of different story and background, but my experience with psychedelics also started young, also started recreationally. Then I got into shamanic work. I got very uppity for a while, where I was like, you can access that part of your consciousness without psychedelics, and psychedelics is cheating. And then,
Yeah,
long story short, they called back to me at some point in my life. So I've always find it really fascinating hearing how that works for people and the
yeah,
timing of things.
yeah.
So then tell me about your book and how that all transpired.
So the book came about. I mean, when I how do I explain this? So I had an editor. For a long time was a travel writer, and still consider myself one. But I had a great editor at the New York Times, where I wrote for the travel section for a long time, who told me, have a good travel story, like above the fold kind of front page travel section story. You need at least three intersecting things. You need a place, obviously, because it's travel, and then you need some sort of animating figure or idea kind of around that place that just helps illuminate kind of sort of when and why you're there. And then the third layer you need is some sort of relevancy, topicality, and I thought once I started reading True Hallucinations, I thought, wow, you have all three and plus some, and you just have this an amazing figure in Terence, an amazing place in La Chorrera, and our current psychedelic renaissance, and the movement advocacy for using psychedelics for therapeutic potential, which had a sort of fourth tie-in to my own father, who totally unrelated to all of this had been a lifelong alcoholic and depressive, and was considering at my behest undergoing some psychedelic therapy for that. And anyway, so that when all this was sort of dawning on me, I mentioned it to my agent, and she was like, "That sounds great. Write a proposal." I did, and she sold it, and here we are.
Amazing. Well, congratulations too. And you're published in a lot of very notable media sources. And so I just want to congratulate you on that. I know I'm sure you've had a lot of work and effort into that, and maybe that's commonplace for you, but I hope that you're happy
Yeah,
with that.
yeah, thank you. No, I'm very pleased. Really very pleased. So thank you.
Great, great.
And I'm just happy to also just get Terrence's story out there, who I think people should know about him,
Yeah.
and know about La Chorrera, know about this weird time and place that I keep referencing.
Yeah.
So that I
Let's
could,
jump right into that. Can you
sure.
share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so it's funny, a reviewer called this an intellectual biography, and I wouldn't call it that at all. Like, I mean,
Mhm.
I wouldn't call it. I don't think of myself as very intellectual, and I don't think it's Terrence was certainly, but so maybe in that sense. But I also don't think of it as a biography of a person. I think of it as a biography of this time and place of La Chorrera, March 4th, 1971, where Terrence and some friends, and including his brother Dennis, undertook what they called this "quote unquote" experiment at La Chorrera.
Mhm.
And that drew me to La Chorrera. which is a remote village in the Colombian Putumayo, where Terence and this sort of ragtag group of friends found themselves in the spring of 1971. They went looking for an obscure hallucinogenic plant called ucahe, which they did not find, but they did find a huge flush of psilocybin mushrooms. As you probably know, as your listeners probably know, psilocybin mushrooms do particularly well in the dung of hooved game, mostly cattle and horses. And there were cattle in La Chorrera thanks to the missionaries, the Jesuit missionaries that had been there for the better part of a century.
Got it.
These large, like sort of Sith-like horned white zebu cattle. And Terence and his friends arrived at just the right time in the spring, kind of wet, rainy time when these mushrooms were coming into beginning to fruit, and they found hundreds and hundreds of them, and really spent the next couple of months eating a lot of mushrooms and taking ayahuasca and smoking a lot of weed and getting to some very weird places, and undertaking what really Terence called this experiment, to try to, in short, kind of break the space-time continuum and established a sort of culture-wide telepathy, let's say. Maybe I could explain that later, but in short, that's or at least what I think they meant by that. I'm not entirely sure. I'm not entirely sure that Terence or Dennis really knows what they were up to, but that's at least how they talked about it afterwards. And so that's kind of the gist of it. And I really wanted to go. I thought the place of La Chorrera was really, no one had, as far as I could tell, who'd written about Terence had ever been there, who had written about the Watoto and Bora people who call it home now. And so I found that really a huge gap in the kind of historical record, and it was just calling to me in a way that I just wanted. I'm a travel writer. I'm just comfortable in that idiom, and I wanted to see it for myself.
Yeah. So I'm sure this is a big question, but what surprised you? What were your expectations and what was the reality for you?
Yeah, well, first of all, that's a great question. There were no mushrooms, for instance. It was one surprise. There's no more missionaries. They left in the early aughts. They had, I'm sure it's not hard to imagine, but missionaries have a sometimes fraught history in South America, in particular, and did so in this village. There's still a strong sort of Christian. There's still a Christian Catholic church there, and a strong Catholic sort of presence among the people themselves. But but as far as I could tell, they weren't sad to see the missionaries go, and so they left and they took their cattle with them, and also, in a sense, the mushrooms. So mushrooms are not indigenous to that area, so which I was surprised to learn. We hung out I went with a friend of mine who's a filmmaker and was making a documentary film at the time, and while I was doing research for my book, and we hung out with a couple of shamans there who were kind of aghast at the idea of psychedelic mushrooms. And we talked to them about ucahe and ayahuasca and all the sort of strange, not strange again in a pejorative way, but just magical sort of, medicine cabinet of psychoactive plants that they use sometimes and towards certain ends, and just have at their fingertips there. And I was surprised to hear from them, about that, I guess, about the sort of their approach to psychedelics and how it diverges, and I think from the typically Western approach, especially with respect to ayahuasca, is just much different from what I imagined. So those were two things, but also just to find a totally vibrant, sort of thriving village, like in the middle of the Amazon. I mean, it was extremely hard place to reach when Terence and Dennis went. It still is, but there's an airstrip now. You can fly in. I think there's like 2 commercial flights a month. Sorry, but Terence and Dennis had to hike in from the nearest sort of. It's not quite correct to call it a port town, but the nearest village from which you can take a boat. It's called El Encanto. It's a 4-day hike from there. And so, yeah, it's incredibly remote and beautiful, just vibrant, wonderful place. And So, and I was really, really floored by the whole experience.
Gotcha. Gotcha. It's interesting. I'm just reflecting. I feel for me as a psychedelic facilitator, I would consider myself probably about halfway between fully, indigenous, like strict, rigid indigenous practice and therapy. Definitely not a therapeutic approach to the way I approach this work. And so I feel like a little bit of both, where I'm super grounded in shamanic practices and spiritual dimensions and that type of thing, but also integrated into the modern context. And just to be transparent, sometimes it hurts my heart a little. I can see the benefit of the therapeutic approach, but it hurts my heart a little bit too, because I feel like the medicines themselves have their own intelligence. I trust them to navigate how they want to be used in the world. And I'm also like, oh, we just end up missing so much of the beauty of what they offer. And I'm just curious, from your personal experience, from your research and your perspective, what would be your dream for psychedelics in the modern age?
Yeah, so well, that's a mother load question
Yeah.
kind of. But I mean, as it's a tough one. I mean, I think psychedelics are like, just to take ayahuasca in particular, is in the Western imagination, I think, is generally pretty far removed from the indigenous context. I mean, at least in the Colombian Putumayo, and I think this is generally true in the Amazon basin among indigenous people. It's typically not taken with therapy in mind. The shamans that I talked to said that it was mostly used to find lost objects, to communicate with dead relatives, for luck in the hunt, and that it's really only in context, in sort of context of white contact, that it has accrued this therapeutic um, veneer. And in fact, one of the and also this idea that indigenous shamans are taking psychedelics all the time and exploring the outer reaches of the mind and space. And one of the shamans we hung out with had never taken ayahuasca before. She was scared of it, and she had been a shaman. She had been apprenticing for like 14 years or something like that. And
Mhm.
so I guess and this is maybe not what you're driving at, but part of my answer would be, I think I would like us to have a kind of honest discussion about what the actual indigenous context is with these plants, and what their uses are, and how that might diverge from our own conception of them. That doesn't mean they can't be used therapeutically, especially if folks are finding them therapeutic and helpful. I mean, that was part of my motivation for suggesting them to my father, who had really struggled for many decades with addiction and depression, and just that sort of black hole of helplessness. So many people feel that, I think, that just totally helpless in the face of kind of material nostrums and modern medicine, and they are just at loose ends and need help. And I think to deny them that help is sort of unconscionable. But I agree too that I think there has to be a wider acknowledgement that that's not all they are. They're not a magic bullet. They don't help. They don't work for everybody. It requires just a bigger discussion that requires much more honesty, and I think it asks us to be kind of wiser and smarter about their approach than what I typically see online, or see in the media, or hear people talk about these drugs and their uses. So yeah, so I guess I would just yeah, should just maybe drive that point home, and just
Yeah.
say that I think we just have to be a little bit guided here by logic and reason, which sounds weird, because like we're talking about like really purely subjective personal experiences. That's part and parcel of psychedelic, um, the whole psychedelic oeuvre. But I think we need at the same time to be sort of be guided by reason and rationality as much as it's possible here.
Mhm. Well, I like what you said with like, can we just have an honest conversation about it? Stop glorifying them, or having misinformation about or indigenous people, or even like there's a lot of assumptions and misinformation around where medicines come from and who has stewarded them over time and all of that stuff. And
Yeah.
I think it gets caught into kind of this like who's right and who has like the biggest stake.
Yeah.
in this and what it means. So I really appreciate that suggestion.
Yeah.
Yeah. For you personally, so you shared a little bit about, what surprised you as far as like the actual place and the things that happened there. I'm curious, do you feel like starting this journey, like on all the different levels, did you go through any kind of transformational process yourself?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, yes and no. It's kind of a complicated answer, but I think going in, I mean, so certainly with Terence, I came to the book as a fanboy of Terence and of True Hallucinations. I think I cooled on him a little bit when once I started talking to like Colombian anthropologists and to shamans, and I realized that a lot of what Terence talked about was maybe not applicable in the way that I thought it was. I think maybe he was sort of wrong about certain things, or and some things I think he just made up out of whole cloth, because he thought it would sell well with his audience. And um, so yeah, I did. But then I think at the end, I hope at least you could tell us in the book. I come back around to Terence and really warm to him again at the end, where I realized like really what his ultimate project was human flourishing and human well-being, and he just really wanted the best for people. I think he went about it in a way in a weird way, a way that I sort of disagree with. I think the best way to approach that human well-being is from a place of love and compassion for people and for our loved ones, and not machine elves at the end of history, which was Terrence's whole thing. I think he kind of missed the plot there a little bit.
Mhm.
Um, and so in that sense, I definitely there was a transformation of my relationship, for lack of a better word, to Terence and his ideas, and but also up to psychedelic drugs. In a sense, I think before I began the whole therapy thing with my father, I had really, really, really big hopes, like outsized hopes, beyond reason hopes for my father and the efficacy of the therapies that he tried. And he just for your listeners, he did ketamine first at a ketamine clinic in Michigan, and then psilocybin therapy with a guide at and also in Michigan in his home of Kalamazoo. And and when neither of those sort of panned out, and but both were actually kind of in different ways disastrous, I cooled on that aspect of things too, while also acknowledging that they not everybody has the experience as my father did, but but that was one potential outcome of these drugs and their therapies, which is a bad one, and that I think is not being really talked about. So yeah,
That's true. I mean, we talk with a lot of people again that have misinformation, and unfortunately, coming from sort of the Western mind context, and the way that psychedelics are talked about and portrayed currently as kind of this like cure,
yeah,
it's missing a lot of how it works. And for it to
okay,
work, it's not just getting it into your body, it's having context, it's having understanding, it's having a relationship with yourself and being able to navigate that, wanting to actually change,
yeah,
all of that
yeah.
stuff factors in to getting a result. And I think of a friend of mine shared this recently, and I mean, I love these medicines. We've seen really beautiful results from them more often than not. And he said he got into medicine work for alcohol recovery, and so he went kind of and just picked a place in South America and ended up with what we'd call a shadow facilitator. So someone really who isn't got the best intentions
Mhm.
or really qualified. That's kind of a weird word to use in this realm because that's not really the context
Yeah,
either. And he's like, yeah. And then so I ended up having a terrible experience and a shadow experience. I'm still integrating years later, and I was drinking beer next month,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But he stuck with it because he understood there was more to it than just take it and hope that it fixes it.
Yeah, and you can see that now with the Trump executive order on psychedelics like last month, and I don't know if you want to date this, but recently in April, um, he sort of joked in the Oval Office about like give me some. I can't remember what he said. Oh, I'll take some or something like that, and which is great. Don't get me wrong. I mean, when I grew up, I think you probably did too. Or, you're obviously younger than I am, but like I think until pretty recently, we all imbibed this war on drugs vernacular that like all drugs are bad. This is your brain on drugs without any really honest discussion about what drugs we're talking about. Like, I mean, what about alcohol and tobacco? And, and now it just seems we sort of flipped one set of priors for another where like all drugs are good without there being an honest investigation of what that means. And, but overall, I think this cultural shift is a great thing. It's a good thing. And, but if you read those articles and get to the bottom, at the very bottom, last penultimate paragraph, oh, by the way, these drugs require integrate, like ongoing therapy before and after dosing. And so, and like, um, and that part I feel like is, at worst being left out and at best just being kind of subordinated to like the last paragraph. So,
Agreed.
um,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's like most things. It's not a one and done. There's more complexity to transformation, to making changes than, just a linear fashion. And even just, actually, this is probably something that I see the most for me in my position, where again, I kind of live in the between the therapy and like fully indigenous realm. And one of the hardest places to support people when they're interested in making a change and interested in working with plant medicine for that purpose is, before we even take the medicine, we need to work with them to kind of get them out of this really linear, black and white frame of reference, or they're going to have trouble navigating the journey itself.
yeah, and it's sort of, I mean, I think it's a kind of danger zone because so many people are hurting and desperate for help, and it's they want hope, and they've here there comes along this new drug, this miracle drug, and it's so it's sort of it's kind of, yeah, tricky territory.
Yeah, yeah, oof, I feel that one. Different question, kind of off topic, more personal.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that I think you said something along the lines of, you don't necessarily consider yourself like an intellectual or have an intellectual approach. And so I get the sense that you probably are kind of hanging out between a couple of different worlds too, like actually having, working in academia and in literature. And then also you've got this background of like loving to explore consciousness and sort of like on the fringe thinking. What is that like for you? And you also wrote another book about Bigfoot.
Yeah, yeah.
So let's throw that one in there too.
Sure, yeah. It's funny. I did not. It wouldn't have been hard for me to conceive, 25 years ago that I would write a book about psychedelics, but I would have never thought a million years I would write a book about Bigfoot.
Okay.
But it just so happened um, that I did, and it happened to intersect with a couple of things that I am really interested in, and have been kind of circling as a travel writer, which is American kind of landscape and uh, just ideas about sort of wildness or its lack thereof, and what it means to kind of what nature sort of means to us, and what it meant to other American writers. Particularly, I'm really interested in this intersection of landscape and literature. So I've written about like Hemingway in northern Michigan, and Peter Matheson and the Everglades, and at Abbey in the desert southwest, and so on. And Bigfoot really resonated with me for that reason, because I sort of see it as in my book, was a kind of metaphor for a lot of things, but especially to me, our sort of vanishing wilderness. Um, and anyway, yeah, I guess I don't consider myself an intellectual, and I am an academic, but I'm an academic bottom feeder. I'm an adjunct, so I have been teaching
Okay.
at the college level for the better part of 15 years, but I really mostly consider myself a journalist and a writer. That's not to besmirch that other side of my profession
Sure,
either,
sure.
but yeah, but I'm interested in ideas, and I'm interested in belief, and why claim to believe the things we do, and where that sort of diverges from disbelief. And sometimes I think when I started the Bigfoot book, and I would say this carried over into the psychedelic stuff, is that I thought of belief and disbelief as these two hermetic, like opposite poles that barely touched and were totally sealed off from one another, and came really to see them as actually really kind of intimately interlinked, and hard to separate at times. It's I think it can be difficult to really say with any conviction sometimes what we actually believe and don't believe. And Bigfoot, I think, is a great example of that. Ghosts, UFOs. A lot of people purport to believe in things that if you really kind of pin them down on it, oh, well, okay, I don't know. Like it's people know what the right answer is, like on a survey, but yes or no answer doesn't quite capture the intricacies of their belief. And
Right.
so I was interested in that, and I am interested in kind of quirky subcultures in the American experience, the kinds of folks who tend to get brushed aside or overlooked or marginalized. And, so my next book is kind of along those lines. It's about UFOs and extraterrestrial intelligence and so on. And I like hanging out with people and going out to the woods and looking for stuff and
Right.
or the jungle, and one of the great things about journalism is at least what I think of as one of the great things. I'm always trying to convince my students of this, and I'm not sure they believe me, but you have this incredible thing called the privilege of access, where you could just call people up and say, "Hey, I heard about this thing you're into. I dig it. Can I tag along?" And you get a chance to sort of immerse yourself and ingratiate yourself among people who would otherwise remain totally closed off to you.
Mm.
And I just find that totally awesome. And so, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but that that's how I think of. I guess that's kind of how I think of my work, and how I think of, in a sense, how Bigfoot led me to psychedelics.
Mhm. Got it. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. So last question, what do you feel like your 8-year-old self would be most proud of for where you are today, what you're doing?
Oh, my 8-year-old self?
Yeah.
Wow. He would be proud that I'm not pumping gas somewhere. Not that there's anything wrong with pumping gas, but that I actually have a job and that I'm doing what I love doing. That I get to do what I just described a moment ago is,
Yeah.
that's a pretty amazing thing. I mean, it took me a long time. I was almost 50 when my first book came out. It took me a long time to
Right.
figure it out, and I did a big walkabout for the better part of a decade after
Mm.
college. And so, but yeah, I think that's it. Is that I'm doing what I really, from a pretty young age, always wanted to do, which is sit at home and write books.
Great.
And yeah, and try to tell stories that go untold. There's I don't know if I necessarily would have seen myself in journalism, but I think I am proud to be a journalist. There's a lot of kind of bad, um, sort of vibes with journalists and journalism right now. I think there's kind of a lot of misunderstanding of what journalists do, like what we're up to, and but the main thing I think is trying to tell stories that would otherwise go untold, and
Mm.
approach people like who like Bigfooters or ufologists, or psychonauts, the people who maybe might seem to the outside world to possess some pretty quirky ideas, but who and who maybe have actually been ignored for the better part of their lives, and that you come along and you get to turn them into a subject, who's somebody who's kind of worthy of our time and attention. And that's a totally awesome thing. It comes with a lot of responsibility, but it's a great place to find yourself as a writer. And so anyway, so yeah, I would be proud of that, I suppose.
Beautiful. Wonderful. Well, I very much appreciate your work, and especially the different intersections you play in, and definitely wishing you the best with your next book. I'm sure I'll be looking into that too. I was just having conversation about aliens with my assistant this morning,
Oh,
so so always fun to explore those different places. And yeah, and definitely feel a connection with the way nature can open parts of our consciousness up, not just when you ingest it, but just being in certain landscapes.
yeah,
And so I think it's super interesting.
yeah.
And yeah, so folks can, if they want to follow you or find out more about your work, johnoconnor.com, is that correct?
That's correct. JohnMOconnor.com. Yep. And yeah, that I'm in my books are in the usual places. So
Great.
yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate being here.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time, and so nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
All right, that's all for now. See y'all next month. Bye bye. Thanks for joining me today. If you enjoyed the show, would you subscribe and leave us a review? Let us know you did at SpiritBird Official. We love to support our listeners. And if you enjoyed this show, please share it with someone else who would also enjoy it. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.